I hadn't even finished chewing the last bite of my dinner when my daughter, Emily, looked up from her phone and said, "Mom, maybe don't eat so much. We're trying to save money." I froze, fork midair, and felt the warmth drain from my body like someone had pulled the plug on my soul. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray, uneventful day when time feels like it's walking in circles. The kind of day where you almost forget you exist until someone reminds you that your presence is a burden. I had moved into Emily's home just 6 months earlier, after a fall in my kitchen made it clear I couldn't live alone anymore. At 72, my knees were unreliable, my balance worse, and my pride already taken a few hits. But none of that prepared me for the slow unraveling of my dignity inside my own daughter's house. Emily was once the kind of little girl who cried when I scraped my knee, who brought me wildflowers and balled-up fists and kissed my cheeks like I hung the moon. Now she was a corporate executive, raising 2 boys and juggling yoga, meetings, and meal prep calendars. Somewhere in that chaos, the space for me had shrunk into something transactional. I was not her mother anymore, I was her dependent. And it showed. That night, after I pushed my barely touched dinner away, I rinsed the plates in silence. My fingers, stiff with arthritis, fumbled with the greasy pans as the boys screamed about some video game from the living room. Emily didn't offer help. She didn't even look up. She was already onto an email or a group chat or something more urgent than her own mother doing the dishes like a live-in maid. It hadn't always been like this. The first few weeks I stayed with Emily, she tried. She really did. She made me tea at night, helped me to the restroom when my hip was acting up, even bought a soft pair of slippers I liked. But that care, that patient sight wore off quickly. Now everything I did seemed to bother her. "Did you use the good towels again, Mom? Those are for guests. You don't need to vacuum. Just rest. But not in the den. That's where I work. Don't touch the thermostat, okay? We have it set for energy savings." Every sentence came wrapped in passive disappointment, like I was something fragile and faulty, breaking things simply by existing. But the worst part wasn't the words. It was the looks. The looks that said, "Why are you still here?" The following morning, I rose before the sun, as I always did. Old habits die hard. I used to get up early to prepare breakfast for my late husband, Roy, before he went to work. Back then, there was purpose in my movements. Now, I woke early just to avoid being in anyone's way. The kitchen was mine for a brief, golden hour before the house woke up. I chopped apples quietly, brewed coffee, and watched the lights slide over the counter like honey. I made French toast for the boys just like I used to for Emily when she was young. I even cut the crusts off, which they didn't notice. When Emily walked in, dressed in her workout gear and barking into a Bluetooth earpiece, she stopped in her tracks. "Mom, I told you. No syrup in the mornings. Too much sugar before school." I looked down at the plate I'd made, now cooling on the counter. "They're children," I murmured. "They'll burn it off." Emily sighed. Not just any sigh, a slow, exhausted exhale that made my heart shrink in my chest. She walked over, grabbed a protein bar from the pantry, and shoved the French toast into a Tupperware. "Fine. They'll eat it for dessert. Later. Thanks." No eye contact. No smile. Just that cold, corporate efficiency she now applied to everything, including her mother. Later that day, I tried to do something nice. I reorganized her linen closet. Folded everything just the way she liked, hospital corners, color-coded. It was a small gesture, but I hoped she'd see it and remember the mother who raised her with love and care. When she got home, her face twisted into confusion, then frustration. "Did you go through my closet?" I just straightened it up. "It was a little messy," I said. Emily rubbed her temples. "Mom, you can't just go touching all my things. I have a system." I stood there, hands still warm from the towels, and nodded. "Of course. I'm sorry." That night, I cried into my pillow, quietly, because even my pain, it seemed, had become an inconvenience. The weeks that followed blurred into one long string of silences and sideways glances. I washed. I folded. I cooked. I sat through school pickups when her nanny canceled. And yet, I wasn't really seen. One afternoon, as I was folding socks, her oldest son, Noah, came and sat beside me. "Grandma, why don't you ever watch TV with us anymore?" I smiled, blinking back tears. "I don't think your mom wants me in the way." Noah frowned. "You're not in the way. You're just quiet now." I kissed his forehead, the way I used to kiss Emily's. Sometimes, When people stop listening, we start being quiet. That's all. That night, something snapped. Emily had hosted a dinner for a few friends' business types, all dressed like they'd stepped out of a catalog. I stayed out of sight, made myself small. But when one of her guests complimented the hors d'oeuvres, Emily smiled and said, "Oh, I just threw something together." I had spent 4 hours making those tiny spinach puffs. My hands ached from the chopping and folding. My feet throbbed from standing too long on tile floors. And she said, "I just threw something together." I went upstairs before dessert. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, watching the shadows crawl across the ceiling, wondering how love could turn into obligation, and how a child could forget so easily the hands that once held her through fevered nights and scraped knees. The next morning, I made a decision. It started with a list. Not a grocery list or a chore chart. A list of what I needed to feel like a person again. Sunlight, freedom, respect, silence that felt like peace, not punishment. And then I started packing. Just 2 bags. That's all I had brought with me when I moved in. A small suitcase with clothes, and a bag with photos of Roy, old letters, a few keepsakes. I didn't need much. I never did. Emily came home early that day. She walked in, saw the bags, and blinked. "What's going on?" I looked her in the eye for the first time in weeks. "I'm going home." She laughed a short, shocked sound. "You don't have a home, Mom." "That's the whole point." "I do now," I said. "Even if it's a tiny apartment. Even if it's just a room. I'd rather live alone with respect than here with pity." Emily's face changed. First disbelief, then a flicker of fear, then something like shame. But I didn't wait for her reply. Because sometimes, walking away is the loudest thing an old woman can do. Emily stood frozen by the door as I zipped the last bag. I didn't look back. My heart was beating so loudly in my chest I could hear it in my ears, but my hands were steady. I had made my choice. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice thinner than I'd ever heard it, almost childlike. I turned, looked her full in the face, and said, "Where I'm treated like a person, not like an appliance." It wasn't anger in my voice. It was resolve. I walked past her with dignity in every aching step. And for the first time in months, I felt tall. Outside, the world was bright with spring. The trees were just beginning to bud, and the breeze carried a promise of something better. I called a cab, gave the address to a senior living complex I'd been researching quietly for weeks. I hadn't planned to move so soon, but something in me knew if I didn't leave now, I might never find the strength again. The ride to the complex was quiet. I stared out the window, watching the city pass like a stranger, thinking about all the years I had spent putting everyone else first. Roy, Emily, the house, the PTA meetings, the bake sales, the unpaid overtime at the school library. My life had been service. I had never minded that, not until it became expected, not until it became invisible. At Oakwood Gardens, the air smelled like lavender and cut grass. The manager, a plump, silver-haired woman named Lorraine, greeted me with a smile and eyes that saw me really saw me. We spoke on the phone. I said, "Margaret Lyons." "Of course," she replied, reaching for my hand. "We've got a lovely studio ready. No pressure to sign today, but let's show you what home could feel like again." That word, home, it hit me like warm soup on a winter day. The apartment was small but bright. A bay window overlooked a courtyard filled with azaleas and wind chimes. There was a kitchenette, a cozy twin bed with a handmade quilt, and a bookshelf already stocked with paperbacks. A rocking chair sat in the corner, worn but inviting. "I'll take it," I said without hesitation. Lorraine smiled kindly. "Would you like us to help you settle in?" "I think I'd like that very much." For the first time in months, I unpacked without feeling like I had to explain why I'd brought what I brought. I hung up Roy's flannel shirt beside my dresses and placed a photo of our wedding day on the nightstand. I breathed. That evening, I sat outside in the courtyard, sipping tea that Lorraine had offered. An elderly man named Walt nodded at me from across the patio. "New here?" "Yes," I said. "As of today." "You're lucky. They got good soup on Tuesdays," he chuckled, tapping his cane. I laughed, a real, open laugh that felt like sunlight inside my chest. The days that followed were quiet, but they were mine. I joined a book club, took watercolor classes on Wednesdays, and even went on a group trip to the botanical gardens. I wasn't just tolerated, I was welcomed, respected. And yet, some nights, I lay in bed thinking of Emily. I wondered if she noticed I was gone. I wondered if the silence in her house felt as loud as it did in my heart. I didn't hear from her for weeks. Not a call, not a message. I tried not to let it hurt, but it did. How could it not? Then, on a Sunday morning, Lorraine knocked on my door. "You have a visitor," she said, her smile gentle. I stepped out into the lounge and saw Noah, my grandson, sitting awkwardly on a bench, clutching a brown paper bag. "Hi, Grandma," he said, standing too quickly. He was taller now, his voice deeper than I remembered. "Noah," I whispered. He nodded. "Mom doesn't know I'm here." My throat tightened. "You took the bus?" He held up the bag. "I brought you French toast. The kind with cinnamon. I made it myself." Tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them. I sat beside him, cradling the warm paper bag like it was made of gold. "I missed you," he said. "The house. It's not the same." "I missed you too, sweetheart." He looked down at his shoes. "Mom's mad. She says you embarrassed her." My mouth opened, then closed. I reached out, touched his hand gently. "You know, Noah, sometimes adults forget that love doesn't mean control." He nodded slowly. "I just wanted to see you. To say thank you." "For what?" "For still being kind," he said. "Even when people stop being kind to you." I pressed my lips together, holding back the emotion. "You're a good boy." He smiled. "You're still my favorite person." We sat there for over an hour, talking, laughing, remembering. When it was time for him to go, he hugged me tighter than he ever had before. After he left, I sat quietly in my chair, looking at the sun drifting through the window. My heart was sore but full. A few days later, Emily called. I stared at the screen, her name glowing like a ghost. I answered. There was silence for a moment. Then, "Hi, Mom." "Hello. I didn't know Noah visited you." "He did. It was lovely." Another pause. "I've been meaning to call." "I imagine you have." "I didn't realize how hard it had gotten for you," she said, her voice cracking just slightly. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to patch over years of silence with a single sentence. "I was overwhelmed," she continued. "With work, the kids, everything. I guess I took it out on you." "You didn't take it out," I said quietly. "You gave it to me, piece by piece, until I didn't recognize myself." There was a soft sound, maybe a sniffle. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know. I want to visit. Can I visit?" I thought for a long moment, then said, "Yes, but as a daughter, not as a manager." She chuckled weakly. "Okay, deal." That weekend, Emily came. She brought flowers, not store-bought ones, but wildflowers. The kind she used to gather when she was small. She cried when she saw my room. "It's so peaceful here." "It is," I said. "Peace is underrated." We talked for hours. About Roy. About her childhood. About my loneliness. For the first time in years, we were two women, not mother and daughter bound by guilt and obligation, but simply human beings, rediscovering one another. As the sun began to set, she turned to me and asked, "Do you think you'll ever come back?" I looked at her gently. "Maybe, but only if I'm invited to be your mother, not your maid." Tears welled in her eyes. "I understand." And I believed her, because something in her had changed. I stayed at Oakwood Gardens. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because, at 72, I had finally learned that boundaries were not walls. They were doors. And for the first time, mine were open on my own terms. I started writing letters, real ones, on paper. I wrote to old friends, to Emily, to Noah. I started living again, not in someone else's shadow, but in my own small, golden light. And when the other residents asked me what brought me here, I always smiled and said the truth. I came here to stop shrinking. And I did. I came here to stop shrinking. And I did. Over the next few months, my world began to widen. I joined a poetry circle, even read one of my pieces at the spring showcase. My hands still shook, my knees still wobbled, but when I stood up to read my poem titled "The Weight of Silence," the applause felt like a blanket wrapped around me. One afternoon in late May, Lorraine knocked again. "You've got mail," she said with a wink. It was a small envelope. Inside, a drawing from Noah, crayon-colored. A picture of me in a rocking chair, a smile on my face, with the caption in messy handwriting, "My grandma is strong." I pinned it on my wall next to Roy's photo. I whispered to both, "That boy will be just fine." Emily began visiting more often. She didn't bring demands or judgments anymore, just herself. Some days she brought takeout. Others she just sat with me in the courtyard, helping me water my tiny garden patch. She listened more. She even apologized again, not with words this time, but with effort. She'd lean her head on my shoulder and say things like, "I forgot how good you smell, Mom." Or, "Do you remember the time I got stung by a bee and screamed for an hour?" And I would smile, remembering that day how I kissed her swollen hand, rubbed baking soda on the sting, and made her laugh through the pain by pretending the bee had filed a police report because she stole its flower. One Sunday, Emily arrived holding a folded paper. "I found this," she said, "in Dad's old box." It was a letter, written in Roy's neat, blocky handwriting, dated 10 years before he passed. "If anything ever happens to me, take care of your mom. Not just with shelter, but with respect. She gave you everything she had. Don't forget who taught you how to love." Emily's eyes were red. "I forgot," she whispered. "I forgot everything that matters." I reached for her hand. "But you remembered in time." Later that week, something unexpected happened. Lorraine invited me into her office. "I got a call from a local paper," she said. "They're doing a feature on residents who've started over late in life. I thought of you." I was startled. "Me?" She nodded. "Your story matters." And so, for the first time in my life, I was interviewed. I sat with a young woman named Jess, barely older than Emily, and talked about courage, regret, motherhood, and what it feels like to outgrow your old life at 72. She asked, "What advice would you give someone your age who feels forgotten?" I said, "Don't settle for surviving. You still have the right to joy." The article came out a week later, titled Her Second Spring. It featured a photo of me in my garden, kneeling in the dirt with a proud grin, holding a tiny tomato plant in my palm like it was treasure. Emily read it and cried, "Mom, you really are blooming." That summer, she brought Noah and his younger brother, Eli, to visit more often. We made lemonade together, played cards, even went to the lake once just like we used to when Emily was small. But one visit stands out in my memory. It was early August. The sun was blazing, and the air smelled of honeysuckle. Emily had just watched me teach Noah how to knit a basic square. When he ran off to show Lorraine his wobbly creation, Emily turned to me, biting her lip. "I think I understand now," she said. "Why you had to leave." I nodded. "I was so angry at first," she continued. "I thought you were abandoning me. But really, I abandoned you first." She looked down. "You were right to walk away." I reached over, touched her. That moment became a turning point. Our relationship stopped being a tangle of guilt and began to grow into something rooted in truth. We visited Roy's grave together on what would have been his birthday. Emily brought lilies. I brought his old fishing hat. We stood in silence, wind tugging at our sleeves, the past whispering between us. "I think he'd be proud," she said. "I think he'd say, 'It's about time you two talk to each other like grown women,'" I replied with a smile. We laughed, and cried, and laughed again. That fall, I received an invitation. A local college wanted me to speak at their continuing education program about aging with agency. I was terrified, but I said yes. When I stood at that podium, I told the crowd, "At 72, I learned something I wish I'd known at 22. We do not owe anyone our silence." A young girl came up to me afterward, teary-eyed, and said, "I needed to hear that." I smiled. "So did I, sweetheart. So did I." Winter came, and with it, changes. Lorraine retired, and a new manager took over. He was kind, though not as warm. But I had found my rhythm by then. I no longer feared transition, I embraced it. Emily offered, gently, to have me move back in his time with ground rules we could both agree to. I declined. "Not because I don't love you," I said, "but because I love me now, too." She hugged me fiercely. "I understand." We promised to keep weekends sacred visit, or I'd go to her place. We would cook together, laugh together, grow together. And we did. On the 1-year anniversary of my move, Noah presented me with a handmade card. It read, "Dear Grandma, thanks for being brave. Because of you, Mom is kinder. Because of you, I want to listen better. Because of you, I believe in second chances." I taped it next to his old drawing. 2 reminders. One from the past, one from the future. Both rooted in love. And I finally understood something I had never been able to say out loud until then. Sometimes, the hardest thing you can do is say enough. But if you say it with grace, with truth, and with love, sometimes the people who matter most will follow your voice back home. The following spring, something unexpected bloomed inside Minute, just peace, but purpose. It began with a girl named Lily. She was maybe 24, a nursing student doing her internship at Oakwood Gardens. She had kind eyes, but looked exhausted, the way young people do when they carry too much too early. One day, she was helping Mr. Friedman with his walker when she passed by me on the bench and whispered, almost in apology, "Some of my classmates think this place is boring, but I think you all have stories no one listens to." That stayed with me. Later that week, I asked Lorraine's replacement Michael if I could try something new. "I want to start a story circle," I said, "for the residents. And the young staff, too, if they're willing." He blinked, then nodded. "What's the goal?" "Connection," I said, "and maybe healing." He gave me the rec room every Thursday afternoon. We started with 4 of us. Me, Mr. Friedman, Miss Alice, who'd been a piano teacher for 40 years, and Lily. That first day was awkward, full of half-starts and long pauses. But by the 3rd week, something cracked open. Mr. Friedman spoke of his time in the war not with pride, but with regret. Alice shared a love letter she'd never sent to the girl she'd met in Paris in 1953. And I told them about the time I almost left Roy, how I packed a suitcase and sat in the driveway for 2 hours before coming back inside, because he'd left a post-it on the steering wheel that said, "Please don't go." I made coffee. That was the first time Lily cried. By month 2, the circle had grown to 15 people. Residents, nurses, students, even a few staff who stayed after hours. We shared stories of love, grief, shame, triumph, and the quiet, invisible battles we'd carried for decades. One afternoon, Lily approached me after the session. "You should write a book," she said. I laughed. "About what?" "About this. About starting over. About what aging actually feels like. Not just aches and pills, but truth." I smiled. "You think anyone would read it?" "I'd read it," she said, "and I'd give it to my mom. And my grandma." So I began writing. At first, it was just scribbles in a notebook, vignettes, memories, phrases like "grief is love with nowhere to go," and "the saddest thing about growing old isn't the loneliness, it's being treated like you were never young." Soon, I started typing it all out with 2 fingers on the community room computer. Lily helped me edit. We'd sit together on Sunday afternoons, her sipping coffee, me with my ginger tea, reading my words out loud until they felt real enough to share. I called it The Quiet Rebellion, a collection of essays, reflections, and short stories about choosing self-respect later in life. Emily was the first person I gave a copy to. I handed her the manuscript in a simple folder, no big speeches. She held it like it might break. "Is it about me?" she asked. "It's about me," I said, "but you're part of the story." She spent the whole week reading it. The following Saturday, she showed up with tears streaming down her cheeks and said, "I'm sorry again for everything I didn't see. And then, thank you for not letting me forget how to love." She offered to help me self-publish it. Noah helped with the formatting. Eli drew the cover, a woman planting seeds beneath a sky full of clocks. It was imperfect, but it was mine. We sold 50 copies to start. Then a local blog picked up the story. Then a podcast. Then a retired teachers group in Idaho placed an order for 75 copies. Within 6 months, The Quiet Rebellion had sold over 2,000 copies online. But more than that, letters started arriving. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Women in their 60s, 70s, 80s wrote to say, "I thought I was alone. I didn't know we were allowed to choose ourselves at this age." One woman in Maine said she'd finally left her controlling daughter's basement after 10 years of being the free babysitter. Another from Texas wrote, "I read your chapter about eating dinner alone, and for the first time, I lit a candle and played music for myself." The letters stacked up in a shoebox I kept under my bed. On lonely nights, I'd pull them out and remember that even the quietest voice can shake something loose in someone else's life. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls golden, Emily brought over a framed photo of the 2 of us from years ago in an apron, her in pigtails, both covered in flour. She set it on my desk. "I finally understand what you gave me," she whispered. I looked at her, and I understand what I had to give back to myself. Noah began recording some of our story circle meetings for a school project. His teacher was so moved, she invited me to speak to his class about aging. I was nervous. Teenagers can be cruel without meaning to be. But they listened, really listened. When I told them, aging is not about decay. It's about discovering who you are without the noise. A boy in the back actually nodded and wrote it down. And when I finished, a girl with purple hair said, "I wish my grandma was like you." I smiled. Maybe she is. Maybe no one ever asked her the right questions. That night, back in my room, I stared at the ceiling and thought of how much had changed. A year ago, I had been invisible in my own daughter's home. Now, I was being heard by strangers half my age. One night in late October, Emily brought something with her. A check. It was small, just a fraction of her bonus, but she handed it to me with a hesitant smile. "It's for you," she said. "Not because you need it, but because I took too much from you for too long without giving anything back." I folded it gently and set it aside. "Thank you," I said, "but what I really wanted was this." I pointed to the photo on my wall. "Us." Smiling. She nodded. "Me too." We sat quietly for a while, sipping tea. Then she said, "I want to tell my friends about your book." "You want to tell your executive friends that your mother wrote something called The Quiet Rebellion?" She laughed. "Yes, because it's the bravest thing I've ever seen." I smiled. "No, sweetheart. The bravest thing was you coming back.